Isn't it amazing that when you try to do global missions, all you need to do would just be to step outside and you're already doing global mission?
Absolutely.
For me, the nations are coming into this country. And when you look at global missions, it's here already. You don't need to go to another country. And when you look at that from that perspective, then this country becomes now a missional opportunity, a missional headspace for us. How then do we minister to people and how do we do missions? How do we share the gospel among people coming from different nations and different countries?
Well, Nestor, what a joy to be with you today. I appreciate you making time to be here with us on the podcast.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here as well.
Tell us a little bit about your world. I know you're in Ontario. Tell us about your family, about the work you're part of, and what you find your hands working on these days.
Well, first off, I'm here in Brampton, Ontario. So this is a new location for me. It's not far from Toronto. It's just the next city. I'm serving here as the global and local outreach pastor of Bramalea Baptist Church. I'm here with my wife. It's just the two of us. We don't have kids. And I've been here in Canada since 2010. So this is a wonderful journey to be here in Canada.
So 15 years ago, you made your way to Canada. What brought you to Canada?
That's a good question. I've been wondering about that myself, but ever since I was in the seminary, actually, I have been wanting to get my postgraduate degree outside of my country of origin. And so that was one of the push factors for me. Although it took a while after graduation from the seminary, but one of those purposes would be such that I would be getting my degree here. And also, when my mother passed away, I felt that God is calling me in another location in terms of doing mission and doing ministry. And so I think those are the two key areas. And so God has been always good to me in terms of answering those personal questions for me in that regard. I grew up in the Philippines. I was born there. I grew up in the Philippines. And so I've served there in a couple of churches, academic institutions as well. And so that's my background.
And so pastoral ministry, also one foot in the academic world. Tell me about that dynamic, because those are two connected worlds, but they have different sort of emphases and ways of being. How have you kind of navigated that dual vocation of living in the academy and living in the local church?
Well, again, that's a funny question because even while I was in the seminary, my prayer actually would be that I would be in a teaching role in ministry. But God gave me and put me in a different location in terms of really serving the church. But even while I was serving the church, I was moved into another area where I was able to do campus ministry. And from there, I was being a pastor among students, among faculty members, and they gave me opportunity to teach. And so for me, that's not a new thing anymore because of that desire to teach. But at the same time, being able to navigate that in the context of a university setting has been such a helpful way. How do I be a pastor, but at the same time also an academician?
Yeah. I think that's a really meaningful space to work within, to bridge between those two worlds. And I think the future of the church in Canada, part of the story of our future is bridging between those two worlds to form pastors, to shape thoughtful leaders. And so really grateful for you living between those two worlds and bringing the best of the other between them.
Yeah, and I love preaching. And so for me, preaching is a matter of teaching as well. And so for me, this is sort of integrating both my passions for teaching and preaching as well.
Beautiful. And what was your first post in Canada? So you come here to study, but you find yourself meaningfully involved with the local church. What was your first assignment?
My first assignment was with a Filipino church. I was an associate pastor serving part-time. And so it was a meaningful opportunity for me to really touch base on what's the context in Canada, because that's one of the most difficult things of being an immigrant, right? You don't know the context, you don't know the culture. And for me, being in a Filipino community was sort of a touch point for me in a way that led me more of a gradual shift into the context here in Canada. While I was serving there part-time, I was led by God and also by my network also to serve at a refugee center. And that's where actually my journey with newcomers began in terms of serving them and being really a minister for newcomers. If I could mention the refugee center that's at Adam House Refugee Center.
Please, yeah. Tell us more.
It's a Christian a Christian ministry to serve refugees, really providing housing. I was put there for the purpose of really engaging Adam House with churches and really connecting with churches so that they could start with their own refugee ministry and also support Adam House. And in that journey, I was able to really catalyze almost 20 churches, walking with them, informing their own response to the refugee crisis through providing support to Adam House and other refugee centers as well. So that has been my journey. And that's where my connection with People's Church, the next step of my journey was. Actually, it came about through that connection at Adam House Refugee Center.
And what did you join People's Church to do?
It was in 2013, and I served there as the newcomers ministry pastor. That means that my role really would be to provide a way for the church to be to create hospitality atmosphere for newcomers. I started that. It's sort of a first step where there was nothing. It was more starting from scratch, and so that was a starting point for me in terms of really focusing more on the needs of newcomers.
If somebody's not familiar with this language of newcomers, tell us a bit about what that represents to you. Who's captured in a ministry dedicated towards welcoming newcomers?
Well, let me just use the definition of a newcomer. A newcomer is someone who's in Canada for 2 years. That's sort of an official category for newcomers. But when I speak of newcomers, these are people who are coming from their places of origin into Canada to be situated here into this new country. But that includes not only immigrants, but also refugees, migrant workers, international students can be included in that as well. And so that's how we could categorize newcomers.
And obviously your story of being a newcomer to Canada yourself at one point has really informed your ministry. What can you tell us about your story that's given you particular skills and conviction towards this ministry?
Well, it's a lived experience. Being a newcomer myself, when I came in 2010, I was struggling. There were so many challenges in terms of adjusting to a new culture, a new context. And I don't know, actually, I don't even have connections when I came into the country. And so it's like, what do I do now? And for me, working with refugees really was reflective of my own journey. It was a lived experience. I know their struggles. I know their difficulties. I know that I could not generalize, but at the same time, I could look at that my own journey is really reflective of the journeys of other immigrants as well.
Immigration and welcoming refugees is a big part of the Canadian story. And it pops up in the news in different shapes and sizes. And some churches have been doing meaningful work in this space for decades. I also know that there's some people listening and this might not be a topic that's front of mind for them. And so can you give us a bit of the lay of the land? Like what, because this is an incredible gospel opportunity and an incredible opportunity to respond to live as the church has been called to live, to welcome strangers, to practice hospitality. But give us a bit of a sense of what's at stake here in Canada? What is the opportunity? Who is this that we have an opportunity to work with?
Let me sort of provide the context first.
Yeah.
Isn't it amazing that when you try to do global missions, all you need to do would just be to step outside and you're already doing global mission?
Absolutely.
For me, the nations are coming into this country. And when you look at global missions, it's here already. You don't need to go to another country. And when you look at that from that perspective, then this country becomes now a missional opportunity, a missional headspace for us. How then do we minister to people? And how do we do missions? How do we share the gospel among people coming from different nations and different countries? Is this not amazing that this is happening right now?
Yeah.
And how come we need to be excited as a church in this regard?
Yeah, it is incredible. Like I'm here in Vancouver, and one of our gatherings welcomes a lot of students. And any given Sunday evening when we gather, I look around and not only visually does it look like the worlds have gathered, when I get to know people, literally they've come from all over the world to study, to learn, or to build a new life here. And it's such a beautiful picture of God's kingdom and represent such a meaningful opportunity. And so some churches, like People's, are starting ministries dedicated to this. Some churches are primarily reaching a minority ethnic group. What are some other expressions of the ways you've seen churches engage in this space?
There are so many opportunities and so many ways of expressing hospitality, whether it might be creating a newcomers ministry or starting just a language program, an ESL program for newcomers. Those would be wonderful opportunities for churches to welcome newcomers. But let me just quote actually the research done by the Pew Research Center in terms of the role of faith communities and, of course, the role of churches.
Yeah.
Well, first off, they identified 3 areas. Actually, the first one would be that churches and faith communities really are sources of practical support for newcomers. So whether it might be housing, stuff that newcomer needs, those are the things that's important. The second one would be building that sense of community. So a newcomer comes into the country without any contact, for example. The first step that a person would do would be to contact a faith community, a church. And that's where that sense of community needs to be developed by churches. That has to be, for me, that has to be the central role of churches in welcoming newcomers. It's important that as a church, we need to see this as a key responsibility. I mean, the Bible has been clear about that. Right? I mean, when we look at the journey of Abraham, for example, of how he was called by God, and even when ways that God has called his people to welcome strangers and newcomers, that should be the role of the church as well.
You know, the language of welcoming strangers, foreigners, it's weaved all through Scripture, and hospitality, you know, all through Scripture, this idea. And it's really central to even our own experience of the gospel and the way that Jesus welcomes us. Someone that maybe wouldn't otherwise feel like they belong, but he welcomes us to his table. Do you have any reflections on how this is more than just a ministry opportunity, but really at the heart of the gospel?
And if I may add, it's really the whole of Scripture that really speaks about hospitality and welcome. One of the learnings that I have, and if I may add this one of my key learnings I have in terms of serving newcomers for all these years has been that it gave me a new way of reading Scripture, a new lens in a way. Because before, in my home country, migration is not an issue really, right? But when I came here, migration becomes an issue not in terms of my own lived experience, but also among the people that I'm serving. And looking at Scripture from the lens of migration really enables you to see that from Genesis to Revelation, it is really about migration, about how God himself became a migrant and how he called his people to take that journey of faith so that he could build that nation. And then he calls this nation to become a blessing to other nations as well. So from Genesis to Revelation, it's really about a story of migration, a story of welcome, a story of God calling nations into his table. So for me, that is the key learning there.
Wow. And so when you found yourself at People's Church, was there a ministry in place? Were you pioneering a new initiative?
There was already some ministries serving international students. But in terms of really the whole church embracing newcomers as a hospitality ministry, then there was nothing really. So I started from scratch.
Yeah, what was that like? Like, what were some of the initial ideas, or like, where do you start with something like that?
There are so many churches in Canada that have been serving newcomers. And my first step was to learn from that church that has been serving newcomers. So I went actually to Calgary for the purpose of learning about what they're doing for refugees and for immigrants. And so that was for me a learning point. And then the second step for me was more about a listening process. So I invited several nonprofit organizations and other ministries as well that are serving newcomers, like Refugee Center representatives and other organizations such as this. And I had a time of focus group discussion with them, just really learning what might be good ways for a church to effectively serve newcomers.
Hmm.
So for me, those key steps were important steps that I have taken. It's more of a listening process for me rather than just, hey, let's start something.
Hmm.
I think that's also a lesson for, let's say, the majority culture.
Hmm.
That one of the ways of showing hospitality would be to have that posture of listening.
Hmm. Say more about that, because I think that applies to so many expressions of ministry, to say, because sometimes you have this vision in your heart, and probably at that time you had a hunch of what could this look like. It wasn't just like a blank canvas, but this conviction of going, I want to learn from other churches and I want to listen to those that I seek to serve. I feel like that applies to any new ministry expression, or even just a conviction as you cultivate and innovate and develop any ministry. Maybe speak specifically to some of your experiences along the way, what it felt like to sit down with these organizations, how your vision of what this might look like began to take shape along the way.
Our tendency is always to really step into a problem. I think that's a human tendency.
Yeah.
When we see a problem, we take steps and immediately we find solutions without even asking as to what the problem is in the first place. And I think that's a human tendency, which is such a wonderful step. But for the journey of newcomers and immigrants, we need to look at first, how are they seeing this new world that they're coming in? They don't speak the language for many of them. They're not fluent in English or French, for example. And so it's important that as a church and as a faith community, we need to have that posture of listening in that regard. That might include practical steps in terms of getting a translator, for example. But really enabling newcomers to speak about their own needs, about their situation. I think there has to be that level of that listening posture where a person does not come in being forced to accept something, but really to be given that space where that person can speak, where that person can say about not only his or her needs, but also ways that that person can have that voice in the context, not only in terms of adjusting to this new culture, but even in ministry.
Yeah.
I am speaking about that because oftentimes there is less opportunities for a newcomer to speak if that person is not fluent, if that person does not know the culture. And so a newcomer leader, a Christian leader, would end up just listening and being in the margins in a way, because that space to speak of that voice is not there in the first place.
So what were some of the initiatives after a season of listening and learning and engaging different partner groups, people operate in this space? And what were some of the first initiatives that you pioneered at People's?
So as what I've mentioned, the newcomer comes in with these needs, practical needs, basically looking for a job, looking for a community, looking for a space to live. And one of the ways that could be done would be just by connecting with organizations that really provide this settlement support. So the first step that I did was to invite non-profit organizations and allow them to have space in the church so that they could provide these settlement services. That was the first step. And then language was a key step as well. And so we started with an ESL, an English for a second language program. And at the beginning, it was just a small group, but later on it grew and grew and grew, and people just realized that there's such a need. And so that was, for me, a meaningful step because it enlarged the number of people that we were able to serve. Later on, we connected with nonprofit organizations for them to serve through the process of settlement engagements and employment support as well. Now, those were just practical steps that invites people into the church space.
Yeah.
The second space that we did was to create a sense of community. So every Sunday, we have a newcomer fellowship that provides that space for conversation, reflection of scripture as well. But it's just really just sitting down together over a meal. And again, that's an important lesson for me. Even just having that meal and eating together would be an important step of hospitality. Inviting people into your homes as Christians would be another step that in terms of that extension of hospitality by the church.
Often as church leaders, we're dealing with almost different spheres that integrate or work together. Like, for example, there's the programming we do, an ESL program or a newcomers lunch like you described, or the church formally partnering with another organization. But then there's the life of the church, the culture of the church. It's like you can have as many programs that are about hospitality, but ultimately we need hospitable people and welcoming people. And so I would love to hear a bit about your experience inviting the existing church into a culture of welcome, into a hospitable environment where it moves beyond program experiences into the life and culture of the community.
Let me refer back to the previous answer that I gave, and that is about having a listening posture.
Yeah.
Again, listening is important, and so creating that space in the church for newcomers to speak and to feel welcome means that instead of speaking, those in the majority culture, those in the home country, should have that ability to listen first about the needs and the situation of the person. Asking questions would be good steps rather than providing solutions. The second step that I would propose for churches would be create spaces to understand other cultures. So intercultural competence for me would be a second significant step that churches and people can follow. And we could train our people in intercultural competence. There are so many tools that we could do that, but more than anything else, it's really understanding how we differ, but at the same time, how we come together. One of the key resources for me that has been so helpful is the book of Jason George's, The 3D Gospel. It's just understanding the culture of newcomers that as they come here, they come from different contexts, different cultures, and they see the world differently. They have different worldviews. And so those things need to be learned by churches. Simple tools that allows them to bridge cultures in that regard.
And then over the years, you've been involved with different expressions of this work in the local church, but also in the parachurch space. Tell me about some of the other initiatives you've been part of over the last decade to support churches and to support newcomers.
One of the key initiatives that we had at People's Church would be to connect with nonprofit organizations. That space of connection with what we call secular organizations would be an important step for us. Because number one, we could be Christ's presence among these organizations. But at the same time, they have the resources, they have the connections, they have the network, they have the specialization to do that. And so if we build these connections with other community organizations and centers, then that enlarges the role of the church and the presence of the church beyond our own four walls. And at People's Church, we have been effective in that regard. In fact, it led to the formation of what we call as Faith and Settlement Forum, where faith communities, churches, and nonprofit organizations come together to discuss ways of working together. Would you imagine that now the church is not just an isolated institution, but really becoming part of that community?
Yeah.
That's an amazing step that we could take as well.
Tell me more about that experience, like whether it was the first time you gathered or something that happened along the way. Like maybe give us a window into some of the stories that came from that experience.
Yeah. Well, if you come into that space, of course, one of the things that you need to be aware of would be that this is a general space. It's not a religious space in that regard. It's not a spiritual space. And that means that you have to work in the context of what's your value in working with nonprofit organizations. Well, of course, service would be one key aspect of that, because nonprofit organizations, government entities that are serving newcomers, and churches have one key value, and that is service. So you need to step down in a way from your own religious biases to make sure that as you work with leaders of this organization, you respect them, their own faith backgrounds as well, and ensure that you are creating a space of respect among people belonging to different faith communities.
Hmm.
And so that's important. And that means that uh, it's not about stepping down. It's really enlarging your own spiritual space in a way, your own space of hospitality. That you're not only welcoming newcomers, you're actually welcoming also people from different faith backgrounds so that you could serve together. And in that way, hopefully that becomes your own missional space as well.
Were there any moments that were particularly challenging as you thought through the nuance of partnering with organizations that are working towards the same solve the same problem or meet the same need, but maybe share different values or core underlining beliefs? Were there any moments of pause or, man, I don't know exactly how I'm going to navigate this? Because I think that's probably what some people feel is like, hey, we would love to partner, but that might feel intimidating or challenging or difficult to move into that space.
The first challenge for me was more about the acceptance of the church community. Because the members of the church would be coming from different, what do you call that, doctrinal or even theological stance. Some people would not be comfortable with allowing another person from another faith community to come into the church. And so that was really challenging. And people were questioning why we're doing this, why we're working with secular organizations for that matter. But when it was taught to them and it was conveyed to them that our purpose would be to make this as a missional space, then the church itself became a welcoming space for these people from different faith communities. They gathered there and we opened up our doors. And so people from these organizations really did their own events and activities inside the church in a way that is non-threatening to them. Could you imagine if we could drop that kind of a barrier, that kind of stance where we are able to welcome people from other faith into our church community and into our church space, then it really enlarges our own missional space as well. So that was a key lesson for me in that regard.
And tell me about what you're up to now. I know that you're not at People's Church anymore. You've moved to Brampton, from the city to Brampton, and I'm not sure if you're pioneering a new work or stepping into an existing ministry, but I'd love to hear, like, what are you up to today? Where do you find your energy towards this cause going right now?
Brampton is a different city altogether in terms of the context, in terms of the situation. I'm not sure if you're aware, but almost half of the population here are coming from South Asia, whether they might be Pakistanis or people from India. And so this is a different context altogether. And most of those whom we are serving in terms of our missional space would be Sikhs and Hindus. This would be the two key religions that we are focusing on. And before I came on board, there was already a ministry serving Sikhs and Hindus and Muslim in this regard. And so we are still trying to frame in what way can we be more effective in reaching out to these faith communities and people from these faith backgrounds. So again, for me, this is a new context, and I have been here for just 18 months. So it's a new context for me. So I'm still learning a lot of things. But at the same time, I'm just so appreciative of the fact that the church is so missional, both globally and locally. And so when I came on board, there were already so many ministries at the local level that are serving not only Sikhs and Hindus and reaching them for the gospel, but really even having a ministry presence in the different communities of the city. We have rented an apartment, or the church has rented an apartment where this apartment unit serves those in that building complex, not only through the provision of practical things like groceries, but also connecting with them and building those relationships. Could you imagine a church really spending a lot of resources to rent this unit and have someone stay there to be a missionary in that space? So again, I'm just so amazed of how God led this church into those spaces of ministry that could not be found even in other work of other churches.
Earlier you mentioned What was the percentage? Did you say almost half the population of Brampton?
Yes. This would be coming from South Asia. And if you look at that, even if you just Google that, I think it's already more than half of the population.
It's just such an interesting, it's such an obvious point, but it's worth pause to go, if a church is called to a particular place and half the people, a third of the people, 2% of the people, have this unique story and unique sets of needs, it just represents such significant opportunity. And I think that there are churches like the ones you've described that are dedicating significant resource and awareness. But I think there's a lot of churches that don't know where to begin or haven't even come to the conviction to go, hey, half the people, a third of the people, whatever it might be, that we're called to reach. There's a unique set of opportunities and challenges there. How have you been able to help people see this opportunity?
When I was in Toronto, we developed what we call as the Toronto Diaspora Coalition. And the purpose of that would be to gather leaders from different ethnic backgrounds so that we could share opportunities in terms of doing missions among different cultures, among different faith communities. For me, that was a significant lesson in terms of really moving forward with my own ministry here. And one of the key lessons would be, how then do we equip other ethnic churches, other diaspora leaders, so that they could become effective? My plan at the moment in my denomination would be to reach out to the different ethnic churches in my denomination and form that coalition again and learn from each other and equip each other. So collaboration and partnerships would be key steps that we could take as a church so that we could learn from each other. I'm not coming here as a teacher in a way. I'm not coming here to push for an agenda or my own perspective of what diaspora mission is. For me, it's about how can I listen from other diaspora leaders as well so that we could share resources, we could share tools so that we could be effective in doing missions among different contexts, among different faith communities.
You've used the language of diaspora church. And just for those listening, can you give a bit of definition to what you mean by that?
People coming into a new country from a home that is not their place of origin. So let's say I'm a Filipino in terms of my background. So I came from the Philippines to Canada. So I belong to this diaspora community in that regard. So when you use diaspora, the best term to use would be people in dispersion, people who have dispersed, people who came out of their country into a new country.
And I often think about, I think I'm using the language of Tim Keller, like a gospel ecology in a city, different churches with different shapes and sizes and emphases. And in a gospel ecology in almost any city in Canada, you have these diaspora churches or churches that are non-English in their presentation or gathering a particular minority. Can you just tell us a little bit about, because this is a significant part of the Canadian landscape. And I think it's a very important part of the gospel ecology in a city. Tell us about the role of churches that might be primarily reaching not just newcomers, but maybe a particular group of people. You pastored a Filipino church. In Canada, in Vancouver, we have Spanish-speaking churches. We have churches that are primarily people who have come from Hong Kong or China. And so tell us a little bit about the role of those churches in the broader gospel ecology. And then maybe if I can add another question, just the scale of those kinds of churches in Canada. I think that for many people, we can miss just how many church communities in a given city are reaching a very unique and specific people.
That's a wonderful question, Jace. We have to divide churches in terms of two categories. The first one would be purely ethnic monocultural churches. These are churches that are really gathering based on their ethnicity, like a Chinese church or a Filipino church or a Punjabi church, for example. And in that regard, their main purpose would really be their heart language, their worship really is in their language most of the time. And so they have that specific role of really reaching out to that specific ethnicity. And so we have to respect that because that's where God has called them to be, and then what it means for them to do missions in their specific cultural context. The second category that I would like to mention would be multicultural churches. Mostly these are big churches that's composed of different nationalities. For example, Bramalea, it's composed of more than 50 nationalities.
Wow.
And so we get there together. And so in that regard, each of these categories of churches would have its own role. The first one would be serving their specific ethnicity. That's where God has called them. But multicultural churches are churches that have been called by God to gather the nations. And so how can that church then become such a multi-ethnic, multicultural community that celebrates culture, that speaks about ways of reaching out to different communities? I think I'd like to mention this. I think what's important would be that in terms of the role of these ethnic monocultural churches, in most cases, they operate independently and they usually are in a situation of isolation. Sometimes there's even less connection with a denomination. What's important, I think, would be for them to be embraced and to be part of the broader church. Because if they just exist on their own, then there's no connection with the broader church community, with the whole body of Christ. And I think those are the steps that we need to take. If you are in a majority culture, you are a leader of a majority culture church, then there has to be that space to invite other ethnic churches to become part of this broader church celebration.
I see that as a real important note, because oftentimes where even church groups in a particular city begin to work together, there can be a real divide there. Like, I guess like worst case scenario is churches aren't working together, but oftentimes, God's drawing people together. I think it's one of the things he's doing in our time is unifying the church, bringing collaboration between churches and organizations and one another. But often when I've seen in a particular city, when pastors gather, you might be gathering a large group of pastors, but there's very few of what you described, the ethnic monoculture church leaders represented, or vice versa. There's a unique gathering of those who might be leading ethnic monoculture churches as you described. How can we bring those together? How do we, even practically, like, is there ways that we can operate differently so that we can create more connectivity and tapestry there?
Let me go back to a theoretical perspective first rather than more of practical steps. I'm not sure if I have mentioned this earlier, but oftentimes ethnic leaders, diaspora leaders, are coming into a space of marginality. I'd like to use the term because that's my doctoral research and that has been my sort of my passion for all these years. By space of marginality means that they're not given a space to speak. They're not given leadership roles, basically. And we could see that now. I mean, in many multicultural churches, it's always being white-led. Even board of mission organizations and head of mission organizations, it's always white-led. How then can we bring them into that space so that they could become part of this collective leadership? They could become part of this whole process of engagement. In a way, the best term to use there would be embrace. How do we embrace them? How do we invite them into that space? If we're talking about practical steps now, then let's reach out. For those in the majority culture, for white leaders, reaching out to these ethnic leaders and then listen. Again, that aspect of listening would be an important step. And then provide them with space where they could exercise those leadership responsibilities, leadership roles. For me, those are meaningful ways of really making sure that we are embracing the whole church concept rather than just being categorized into different modalities.
Can you tell us about some of the unique challenges that churches who are reaching a specific ethnic group are facing. I know that one of the challenges, for example, is second, third generation. Like, they welcome people who share a culture and have that felt need to be known and seen. But then as their children grow up in Canada, for example, the way they relate to that church or another church, they can feel isolated or don't know where their home is.
There's always this gap between generations. For first generation immigrants, that's really the challenge here. They love to worship in their own language and their own cultural context in particular. But for second generation, most of them are really steeped into what we call Western culture, Western context, and they love to worship in this regard. If we create a modality where there's no welcoming for both and there's no conversation between these generations, then I think that's why we would fail. If we don't provide space for the second generation to worship in their own context and to express church in their own context, then we would be losing them as well. In the same manner for immigrant churches, first generation ones, if they are not allowed as well to worship in their own specific culture and context, then we would be losing them as well. How then do we bridge that? And we have seen those challenges. There are so many churches that are divided into two generations.
Yeah.
But how can we allow connections to happen between cultures, even if we allow them to worship and to express church in a different manner? Let me set an example. At Bramalea, we have a South Asian congregation here. They're part of the main church, but in a way they're distinct and separate as well because they have their own worship service. They worship, of course, in the same building, but every 11 o'clock on Sundays, they have their own worship service in their heart language, and then the main church worships in English. Yet, what's interesting that's happening is that the kids of this first generation of South Asians really worship in the main church, in the English congregation. Are we sensing a gap? Possibly. And I think that's always clear. But if there's always this interconnection between the first generation church and the second generation church, the multi-ethnic one, as long as there's that space for interconnectivity and intergenerational connection, then I do believe that both congregations will grow. And for me, I love this because we're not losing the second generation immigrants because they worship in a multi-ethnic church. So it's a win-win in this regard.
Yeah. Can you speak a little bit about the idea of gospel contextualization? Like what it looks like to, out of the listening, out of the proximity with others, contextualizing the message and the ministry of the gospel towards the people that you're called to?
Mm-hmm. Well, first off, the gospel is really the absolute truth. But it has to be spoken of in the context of people so that they could understand it in their context and in their culture. That posture of humility would be important in terms of the principle of contextualization, because it allows you to really see what's in that culture rather than just force a Western context, a Western value into your missional space. So that aspect of humility, of ensuring that you are listening, and then allowing that person to express the gospel in their own context would be that important step. Of course, again, as what I've mentioned earlier, it's important that the gospel should be translated in terms of the culture of that people. And I've mentioned about Jason George's book, which is really, for me, again, that's a wonderful step. And that's not the only book that that we could mention, of course. But understanding where that person comes from in terms of his own or her own culture, whether it might be, that person might be coming from a shame culture where shame is such a strong aspect of how they live, or even in cultures like fear is the sort of the key aspects of their culture, then how do we translate that the gospel in their context in that regard, right? So we're not just imposing a Western standard, a Western value, a Western way of doing church but really understanding, can we allow them to worship in their own context and their own cultures? So one other contextualization would be, can we do worship in another language, perhaps? Worshiping in a song from a different language. I think that's a wonderful way of really contextualizing and respecting that culture as well.
What's giving you hope right now? You've got a unique vantage point to the opportunities, the challenge, and lots of expressions of ministry to minorities in Canada. What's giving you hope? What's encouraging you?
Thank you for asking that question. Well, what gives me hope is that the church is alive. And what's bringing this life into the church right now would be the diaspora communities. People from different nations coming into this country, enlivening the life of the church, becoming members of this church. Oftentimes we see, and there's always this tendency to be negative about what's going on in churches in the West, that the growth of the churches in the global South. But the global South is coming here. And so they are fueling this revival of churches in the West, in the Sigurd. And so what gives me hope? That the church is alive. And that the church will continue to grow through the giftings that is being brought here by diaspora communities, by ethnic leaders, by people from different nations, and coming here so that we could celebrate together in spite of our differences, in spite of the fact that we come from diverse backgrounds, yet we come together as a church and worship. Nothing is more important than that. And for me, that's a reflection of Revelation. I love Revelation 7 verse 9. It speaks about how in that last days, all nations will be coming together and they would be worshiping before the throne, right? And so what's happening here in Canada would be a reflection of that.
It's like a sign of the kingdom, some of the inbreaking kingdom now.
That's true.
Beautiful. I'm really grateful for this time together. I feel like I've learned a lot. I've just enjoyed hearing your story and your passion. And so thank you so much for taking the time to share that with us today.
Thank you so much as well, Jason. I hope that I was able to give a coherent answer to your questions.
Oh, I just wanted to chat with you. You're great. You're amazing. Like, honestly, it's just an important conversation. And, you know, there's no simple answers to all the practical steps, but you've just given us a real window in to an opportunity and needs, but also a frame and a handle for how to even begin to wade into this space. And so I'm just so grateful.
Thank you so much for inviting me here.